And joining us now is Rory Stewart. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Turquoise Mountain Foundation, a non-profit, non-governmental organization, and a former just about everything. Diplomat, man about the world. We're going to get into that. I understand you walked here today from Montreal, is that right?
That is not correct.
That is not correct. Well, I'm being only half facetious because, of course, you have walked across Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, India, and Nepal, which does beg a rather obvious question: why do this? So what's the answer?
I'm very, very bad at answering that question. But the thing that I found walking was that it gave me a unique insight into village life. I stayed in 500 different village houses on the walk, and that gave me a real insight into rural Islamic culture, which is very important for all my work, because in Afghanistan, where I work now, of course, 80% of the community live in villages. And one of the ways in which I feel that I have a great privilege, an advantage over some of my colleagues, is that I've had some insight into how life works in villages.
Was there no easier way to get that knowledge than by doing what seems like a very difficult thing to do?
Well, it was also a lot of fun, of course, and that's something that it's difficult to convey. To get the privilege to see inside 500 different people's houses and live with them, to be able to walk 20 miles a day across a landscape that changes very slowly, to see the great snow mountains of Afghanistan in the middle of the winter, which you could never see if you traveled by vehicle.
To be shelled by, enemies who were all too happy to put a bullet through your head. Was that part of the fun as well?
Yeah, well, that was less fun.
That was less fun.
That was less fun. But 95% of the people were incredibly generous, welcoming, kind, dignified, and impressive, and it really restored my faith in humanity.
Again, I didn't mean to be facetious about it, because you did come under fire.
Right.
Is that not a... does that not give one pause?
I think it does give you pause, but one of the great things I've found in both Afghanistan and Iraq is that often the people trying to attack me are very likable. So that a man who I used to have lunch with a lot in Nasiriyah, who was called Asad al-Ghazi, attacked me on my compound for 3 days with 300 militiamen, fired about 300 rounds of mortars and rocket-propelled grenades into the compound, trying to kill me. And when I saw him again about 5 weeks later, he came up to me and he embraced me and he hugged me and he said, "Mr. Rory, you are my hero, I love you." And I said, "Asad, why were you trying to kill me?" And he said, "Mr. Rory, that's nothing personal."
Nothing personal. This is when you were the governor in southern Iraq?
That's right, that's when I said that.
Interesting. Were you the first, quote-unquote, tourist to be in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban?
I think pretty much, yeah.
What was that experience like?
Well, fortunately, I didn't meet too many foreigners, so I wasn't really experiencing it as being the first tourist. But it did mean that I had a great privilege again there, because most of my colleagues, I'm of course a British diplomat and before that a soldier, were working hard and concentrating on their professional life, and I had the leisure to talk to people and walk around and see things.
Let's do the quick background check here. You're Scottish, ostensibly, but you're born in Hong Kong, grew up in Malaysia, you speak Farsi. How did you, why do you need to speak Farsi?
Well, I learned it partly in Iran and partly in Afghanistan. A lot of the languages I speak, like Indonesian and Urdu and Nepali, are related to Farsi. So it's a bit like speaking some French and then learning Spanish and Italian.
Gotcha. Do people ever confuse you for Lawrence of Arabia or James Bond or somebody like that?
I wish I'd have a girlfriend if they did.
No, but your life experience, and people have obviously made the analogy before, right?
I have a lot of respect for Lawrence of Arabia, which is a difficult thing to say today. He's a very problematic, troubled character. But I think there's something very interesting about what that man did during the First World War, because that was a very stiff time in British life, very stiff time in British colonial life. And whatever you say about him, what he did have is a genuine respect and admiration for people in the Islamic world, which is difficult to find even today.
And you have that as well, I presume.
I feel that very strongly, and I feel it's a difficult thing to talk about, because if you make complimentary comments about Afghans or Iraqis, people think that you're being romantic or an Orientalist. But the reality, of course, as anyone knows who's worked in those countries, is that people are unbelievably impressive, courageous, resilient. In the case of Afghanistan, they've emerged from 25 years of war, which should have created a paralyzing trauma, and instead you find people very entrepreneurial, very dynamic, very self-confident, and it's a pleasure to work with them.
Rory, how did you end up being Britain's quote-unquote man in Iraq? Southern Iraq, anyway.
I was very fortunate, but I didn't think there was much competition for the job. Many of my colleagues have families, many of them were reluctant to go to Iraq. I love that part of the world, and I volunteered and pushed hard for it, and I was lucky enough to get the job.
And what were your responsibilities there?
They were pretty extraordinary. I took over from a cousin of Saddam, who was an Iraqi general, who'd been the governor of the province. And when I arrived, there was no Iraqi governor. And I was supposed to exercise all executive, legislative, and judicial authority over nearly 1 million people. The reality, of course, is that a lot of this power was simply the theater of power. The reality is the coalition has never really controlled Iraq. We preside over it. In some ways, we pretend to control it. But I had $10 million a month to spend in vacuum-sealed packets that I was supposed to distribute. We refurbished 240 out of 400 schools in the province, all the clinics and hospitals. We created over 3,000 jobs. And yet, at the same time, the mission was a failure. It
Why?
was a total disaster. It was a disaster because in the end, we didn't win the consent or the imagination of the Iraqi people. And it doesn't matter how many schools you repair, it doesn't matter how many clinics you do up. If a powerful, effective minority of the population wants to kill you, and the majority is sitting on the fence and doesn't want to fight on your side, you're doomed.
In hindsight, was that even ever possible?
Hindsight, I don't think it was ever possible. I think we often talk about Iraq as though somehow the problem was that the United States and Britain sent in the B team, or that the problem was that the administration wasn't intelligent enough. Now, of course, there were a lot of errors. There was bad planning. Probably shouldn't have abolished the army, shouldn't have got rid of the Ba'ath Party. But my guess is that even if we'd got those things right, it would have failed, that it was doomed to failure.
Shouldn't have done it in the first place then.
Should never have gone in.
You were a supporter at first.
I was, and I was terribly wrong. I completely underestimated the extent of opposition we'd face. And I think that's because I'd served in central Afghanistan, I'd served in the Balkans, and I'd felt in those interventions that we genuinely were doing some good, and we had some local support. But in Iraq, that turned out not to be the case.
What were the main obstacles you came up against in the course of doing your job in southern Iraq?
The largest obstacle is that communities in southern Iraq were themselves very confused. 54 new political parties had emerged in the space of about 3 months. And even an Iraqi would hesitate to distinguish between Harakat Dawah, Hizbi Dawah Islamiyah, Hizbi Dawah Tanzim al-Iraq, which is to say the Islamic Call Movement, the Islamic Call Muslim Party, the Islamic Call Iraq Tendency, let alone all these parties that called themselves Hezbollah or Hamas and had nothing to do with parties the same name in Lebanon or Palestine. In other words, it was an unbelievably complex situation, 14 different tribal groups, each with 5 different general sheikhs vying for power. A government that had been very centralized had collapsed, and people were very reluctant to take political responsibility.
How old were you when you got that gig?
I was just over 30.
Did you find your youth a problem for you in getting the respect of the locals?
I was surprised to find that wasn't the primary problem, and I think that's partly because in a society like Iraq, which was a revolutionary society, a lot of the government had been very young. Saddam, of course, had been 29 when he became de facto president of the country. A lot of the tribal sheikhs were very young. Muqtada Sadr, who was in many ways my major problem in the province, was 2 years younger than me. He was 28 years old.
Of course, you couldn't quite do business the way they did business.
No, there were many limitations, yeah.
You didn't walk around with a sidearm and cowboy boots.
Absolutely, and I didn't have a big moustache.
How much lying did you have to do in the course of your job in order to survive?
I think quite a lot, and this is a very problematic thing. I think it's something that we're not often honest about, that really this job is like being a 1920s Chicago ward politician. You have to lie, you have to cajole, you have to manipulate. In some cases, you have to come quite close to bribing people because you're trying to hold together a society that's traditionally based on patronage, a very fragile situation with civil war and insurgency on the edge. You have to make promises to people and then hope that you can keep those promises without knowing that you're going to be able to do so. You have to project power which you don't really have. I spent a lot of time standing on the steps of my small compound with 300-400 demonstrators outside, screaming, "Mr. Rory Stewart is a donkey and death to the governor," and say to them, "You're going to have to go home, you cannot do this, we are the government here," while knowing that in many ways I was pushing my luck and that I couldn't really be confident of the support behind me.
When did you finally leave southern Iraq?
I left when we transferred power to the Iraqi government at the end of 2004, and then I returned in 2005.
Were you happy when your official responsibilities were finally over? Happy to leave that place?
I was very concerned, and this, of course, is the situation the US administration has got itself into more generally in Iraq. I was concerned the whole place was going to collapse into civil war. Was very aware that there were little tribal groups, militias, fighting it out town by town, village by village. But I was wrong, because in fact, Nasiriyah is now much more prosperous, much more stable than it was when I was there. And ironically, our withdrawal has forced Iraqis to take political responsibility. They've done so not necessarily in ways that we like. They've posed a very aggressive security policy with checkpoints on the roads, policemen with rocket-propelled grenades. But the reality is the situation is better than when we were there, and I think that might have a lesson for the whole of Iraq.
Can you, let's follow up on that. You believe the situation is better today than it was before you got there?
In that province, which we left. And my guess is that were we to leave Baghdad and the Sunni Triangle and to stop our aggressive military operations, eventually Iraqis would be forced to take political responsibility, sort out their problems, and rebuild a sense of nationhood. Our presence there is infantilizing people.
So rather than the surge that President Bush just announced a few weeks ago, you think they ought to go the other way?
I think we should withdraw entirely.
Right away?
I think it could be measured, but we need to get out. And my problem with people who say we need an exit strategy is that's usually an excuse for endless delay. We were being told that we were going to leave in 2004 and then in 2005, so I'm beginning to push now for immediate withdrawal because I don't trust politicians not to wriggle out of the way if we give them a timeline.
Are your folks still alive?
They are. My father's now 84, and he's in Fiji with my mother at the moment.
Do they sleep at night knowing what their son is up to most of his days?
I've worried about that. I mean, it was a problem when I was walking across Afghanistan. I certainly pushed my luck with my parents, and one of the reasons that when I got to Kabul I came home is because I didn't want to put her through any more of that.
Let's talk Afghanistan. You're currently in well, you're currently here in the studio, but I mean, you currently live in Afghanistan, Kabul.
Yeah.
Why do you live there now?
I live in Kabul because I run a project which is leading an urban regeneration project in central Kabul. I returned to Kabul about a year and a half ago, and I found the garbage was still 7 feet deep in the center of the city. There's no sewage, there's no water. Beautiful historic buildings were collapsing. The old traditional souk or commercial bazaar, completely dilapidated, and it was a disgrace, shameful. Same time, I found amazing Afghan craftsmen, woodworkers, ceramicists out of work, selling fruit in the market. And I really believe that if you invest in those kind of things, you can be investing in things which Afghans want. They want jobs, they want incomes, they want a renewed pride in their national culture. A lot of these traditional crafts are things which can generate jobs and incomes. The carpet industry is doing very well. We should do the same with woodwork and ceramics. So I'm trying to bring all these things together, set up a cultural center, regenerate the center of the city, produce something which I hope maybe in 50 or 60 years' time, Afghans will still be able to point to and say, this is something the international community did for us. Because there are precious few things of that sort. Afghans are sitting there saying, the international community spent $10 billion in Afghanistan. What is to be seen for it? There's nothing to be seen for it. Bring back the Russians.
Well, that's what they said. The Russians at least built bridges and dams and so on, even if they occupied the whole country.
Absolutely.
You know, it's funny you say this because not too long ago I went to hear Bill Clinton speak in Hamilton, which is about an hour west of here. And one of the central themes of his speech was, this is an unprecedented time in human history for ordinary people, through non-governmental organizations such as your own, pick one, he said, to change the world. I'm telling you, when you watch the local news, when you watch international news, it's impossible to believe that, because it looks like it's just misery and destruction everywhere. You're there on the ground. You're on the front lines. Is Clinton overdoing it?
I think he's actually probably right. And I think the way in which Clinton's right is that he's thinking like a politician, not like a bureaucrat. One of the problems is that we're very timid in Afghanistan. We seem on the surface to be being very courageous and ambitious, but in fact, we are missing so many opportunities, so many unmet needs. There's so much to be done in Afghanistan. And that's why I'm disappointed that we're pursuing a policy which seems to me destined to failure. We're chasing the Taliban around the rural areas. In a counterinsurgency campaign, we're never going to win. We're pushing for a state-building project that's never going to succeed. We're pushing to eliminate illegal narcotics, which honestly I don't think we're going to be able to do.
What's the alternative?
We should be focusing on things which Afghans are demanding. We should be clearing the garbage. We should be building roads to get the economy going again. Afghanistan's in a unique position between Pakistan, Iran, and Uzbekistan. If we can get the road infrastructure going, they'll get income from it. Afghans are unbelievably entrepreneurial and energetic. We need to empower them. And we can also, fine, absolutely protect our national security. Completely in favor of United States troops continuing to follow counterterrorism strategies. They need to protect United States soil, but that is not the same as chasing the Taliban up and down the country. Most of those people that we're killing in the Taliban have no intention of attacking the soil of NATO countries. They don't have any fixed political manifesto. Many of them are villagers who simply believe they're fighting for Islam in Afghanistan against a foreign military occupation.
The fear, of course, is that the Taliban get back into power, provide safe haven to the people who do want to knock down the Twin Towers, and you're back to where you started.
We can deal with that. We can prevent that happening without chasing the Taliban around rural areas. The way we do that is through special forces operations, intelligence-led operations. We need to attack terrorist training camps when they emerge. And the Taliban's never going to take over the Kabul government. I don't know any Afghan who seriously believes the Taliban is about to take over the government in Kabul.
Well, Canadians have almost 3,000 troops over there, doing a lot of the search and destroy that you're talking about right now. They've got a lot, probably, I think, per capita, we've got some of the heaviest lifting going on over there. You want to give our government some advice on what to do with those troops?
It's not my place to give the Canadian government advice, but I believe it's necessary to have troops on the ground. We're very grateful the Canadian government is participating. I think it's very important that Canada should play its role in NATO, but I think it needs to be a more limited and cautious role. We need to accept the limits of our power, accept there are things we can't do. We're focusing too much on abstract moral obligations. Ought implies can. We don't have a moral obligation to do what we cannot do. Let's focus on what we can do, and there is so much to be done in a country like Afghanistan.
Well, let me follow up on that. You've created something called the Turquoise Mountain Foundation. First of all, what's it named after? And second of all, what's it doing?
The Turquoise Mountain Foundation is named after an amazing city which was the center of a civilization in Afghanistan in the 12th century, which was destroyed by Genghis Khan. It's a great symbol because it's a time when Afghanistan was teaching the world about art, about literature, about painting, about dance even. It's a great, great tomb to a dancing dervish in the center of the Turquoise Mountain. But it was destroyed by Genghis Khan. It's been looted extensively, and it's largely vanishing. So what our project is about, it's about saying, look, okay, we're in Afghanistan for a range of complicated reasons, including 9/11. But while we're there, we're going to try to do a project which will catch Afghan imaginations. A symbolic project, a project that says, you can take pride in your country again. Encourage Afghans to create a narrative of identity, build a nation. At the moment, the only narrative that they've been given is the narrative of jihad against foreign occupation. It's not a useful narrative. They should be drawing on all that exists within their history and their traditions that brings all these disparate ethnic groups together and use it also to create jobs and incomes, and that's what our project is about.
And I think I read this, that unlike the hundreds of millions that are being spent on a variety of other things around there, this is a fairly modest budget.
It's a pretty cheap project, yeah.
12 million bucks?
Exactly. $12 million, we can redo the whole of the central Kabul, and I think leave something serious and impressive for Afghans. It's beneficial for them and beneficial for us.
It is heartbreaking, though, to think about. I mean, this is a country that's been at war almost nonstop for a very, very long time. And you may, through the most wonderful of intentions, go in there and give people jobs, and it takes nothing like that to wipe out 5 years of your efforts.
Absolutely.
Does that not distress you?
The great inspiration is the Afghans themselves. You would think after that experience of 25 years of war, they would be traumatized and paralyzed and doing nothing. Instead, I have 150 staff, some of whom have seen their families blown up in front of them, who are getting out of bed every morning, working 14-hour days and rebuilding their city. And if they're prepared to do that, I'm prepared to work alongside them.
Do you not ever see yourself, like most former diplomats, just retiring to a villa in the south of France someday?
So that would be a great fantasy. I'm looking forward to that.
Is that really in the cards for you?
No, it depends how I get out of bed in the morning. Depends what kind of problems I have.
How long do you see yourself staying in Afghanistan?
Until we've got this project properly established, and hopefully until we got the project finished. And then I'd like to come back and look at what we're doing in our own societies. It's quite easy, of course, for somebody to go into Afghanistan and find out what needs to be done, because the garbage is 7 feet deep in the streets, right? It's quite practical stuff to be done. But what disappoints me about the West, what disappoints me about the United States and Britain, is that nobody is articulating an ambitious vision for where we want our own societies to go. We're going out around the world and preaching to other people about democracy and this, that, and the other, but I don't get the impression that we have a really clear vision of how we want to improve our lives. I want to see people being more hopeful, more ambitious, about painting a picture of their own futures.
It's very good of you to spend so much time with us here today at TVO. I know you have not been off a plane for all that long, and you're still on Greenwich Mean Time. So it's very late or early in the morning, I guess, for you at the moment. So, Rory, it's great to meet you. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.